as it crept into the station, its iron wheels screeching against the rails. Among the weary travelers, a man stepped off the carriage, a figure both fragile and dignified. Prince Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin, his pale blue eyes, wide and childlike, wandered over the unfamiliar city. For years, he had been far from Russia, hidden away in a Swiss sanatorium, where delicate voices and soft winds shaped his days. Now he returned to the cold heart of his homeland, a place pulsing with ambition, greed, and secrets. In his hand, he clutched a worn letter. It was addressed to General Yepinchin, a distant relative, and the first thread connecting him to this sprawling city. Mishkin's clothes were simple, almost shabby, yet there was something regal about his presence, as if his soul carried a quiet nobility that the city might not understand. The streets bustled with life. Carriages rattled by, merchants called out. And yet, Mishkin moved through it all as if in a dream. He was not here for wealth or power. No, something more elusive had drawn him back. Perhaps fate. Perhaps something darker. As he wandered, he encountered a man, a stranger whose dark eyes burned with something dangerous. Parfeon Rogozin. The very air around him seemed charged with restless energy, like a storm waiting to break. "My name's Rogozin," the man said, his voice rough but compelling. "And you, sir, look as though you've come from the moon." Mishkin smiled gently, unbothered by the remark. "Prince Mishkin, I've just returned to Russia after many years." Rogozin's gaze narrowed. "A prince, you say? Well, I'm no prince, but perhaps we share something in common. I've just come into money. A fortune, in fact." There was a pause. A fleeting moment where the air between them grew heavy, "and I intend to spend it." Rogozin spoke with a reckless pride, but underneath it there was a shadow. Mishkin sensed it, the kind of shadow that clings to a man consumed by obsession. "And what will you spend it on?" Mishkin asked softly. Rogozin's eyes darkened. "On her." The words hung in the air like a threat. Her. Nastasia Filipovna, a name that would soon haunt Mishkin's every step. Rogozin's lips curled into a thin smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "Nastasia Filipovna," he repeated, as if speaking her name could summon her. Prince Mishkin tilted his head slightly, curiosity stirring behind his gentle gaze. "Who is she to you?" Rogozin let out a short, humorless laugh. "To me, she's everything and nothing. A woman so beautiful, she drives men mad." "And I," he paused, voice dropping. "I would burn the world to have her." The prince's heart stirred uneasily. There was something dangerous in Rogozin's tone, a passion that smoldered too close to hatred, but Rogozin leaned in, lowering his voice. "You'll hear of her soon enough. Every man in this city does. They either worship her or fear her." Mishkin studied Rogozin for a moment, then gently changed the subject. "And what brings you to St. Petersburg?" Rogozin straightened, the moment of vulnerability vanishing. "My father's dead. Left me a fortune. So I'm here to find her, to claim her. Money talks, doesn't it?" There was no joy in his words, only a grim determination. The train station around them hummed with life, yet it felt distant, as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Mishkin felt a strange chill, sensing that fate had bound their paths together. Later, as Mishkin made his way to General Yepinchin's residence, Rogozin's words echoed in his mind. The city seemed heavier now, cloaked in secrets. At the grand entrance of the Yepinchin household, the prince paused, smoothing the creases in his coat. He was a prince by name, but lacked the airs of nobility. Still, he carried himself with quiet grace. The doors opened, and he was led into a lavish drawing room where General Yepinchin sat, his sharp eyes sizing up the stranger before him. "A prince, are you?" The general scoffed. "And what brings you to my house?" Mishkin offered the letter with both hands. "A distant relation, sir." "I hoped." "Well, I hoped for your guidance." The general raised a brow but said nothing. His wife, Lizaveta Prokofyevna, entered, curious about the visitor. Yet it was their daughters, especially Aglaya, who noticed something different about him. Not his shabby clothes, but the strange purity in his demeanor, as if he were untouched by the vanity of their world. But in the glittering halls of the rich, purity could be a dangerous thing, and somewhere else in the city, Nastasia Philippovna sat in a grand room, surrounded by admirers who both adored and despised her. Her laughter, sharp and mocking, cut through the air, but even she could sense it. Something or someone was coming. St. Petersburg glimmered under a pale winter sun, its grandeur masking the restless hearts of those who wandered its streets. In one of the city's most opulent salons, Nastasia Philippovna reclined gracefully, a figure of haunting beauty and undeniable command. Her dark eyes flickered with amusement as she listened to the empty flattery swirling around her. Men laughed too loudly and leaned in close, but she remained untouched by their words. Nastasia knew the game well. They desired her, feared her, and resented the power she held over them. But none dared look deeper, except perhaps Rogozin. He stood apart from the others, his gaze fixed on her like a predator circling its prey. His obsession was not cloaked in charm or subtlety. It burned openly, dangerously. "You still follow me like a shadow, Parfeon," Nastasia murmured, voice like silk hiding steel. Rogozin smiled thinly. "And you'll never outrun me," she laughed, sharp and cold. "Is that a promise or a threat?" Before he could answer, the door to the salon creaked open. A new name floated into their world, Prince Mishkin. The guests exchanged glances, curious and dismissive. Who was this man with modest clothes and unguarded eyes, walking into a den of wolves? Mishkin entered with a quiet grace, unbothered by the room's scrutiny. His gaze met Nastasia's and held, not with desire, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. Understanding, for a fleeting moment, her playful mask faltered. "Prince Mishkin," she purred, recovering. "What brings you into such treacherous waters?" He bowed slightly, offering a gentle smile. "Perhaps I'm searching for the truth in them." The room tensed. No one spoke to Nastasia like that. Rogozin's eyes darkened. "Careful, Prince," Rogozin growled, stepping forward. "You don't know the games we play here." But Mishkin didn't flinch. His calm unnerved them all. "I don't play games," he replied simply. Silence stretched thin in the room. Then Nastasia laughed a genuine, startled sound. "Oh, how refreshing. A man who speaks plainly. But tell me, Prince, do you think me wicked?" Mishkin's answer came soft but certain. "No, I think you are in pain." The laughter died. The room, once so loud, now felt suffocating. Nastasia's expression turned unreadable. For the first time in years, someone had seen beyond the glittering facade. And it unsettled her, but Rogozin saw it too. The way her eyes lingered a second too long on the prince, danger sparked in his veins. Later, as the guests drifted into shallow conversation, Rogozin leaned close to Mishkin, his voice a low warning. Stay away from her. But Mishkin, ever gentle, only looked at him with quiet sadness. "I fear it may already be too late." Outside, the city groaned beneath the weight of its secrets. And within those walls, a delicate thread began to weave between three souls fragile, yet destined to unravel. The cold breath of St. Petersburg pressed against the window panes as night crept over the city. Inside the lavish salon, the air was stifling, heavy with unspoken words. Nastasia Philippovna sat motionless, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of a crystal glass, Prince Mishkin's words echoed in her mind. I think you are in pain. No one had dared to say such a thing. Not in this world, where masks were worn like armor across the room. Rogozin watched her, his dark eyes burning with something between hunger and fury. He had noticed the change in her, the way her gaze seemed distant, drawn to thoughts that didn't belong to him. The tension between the three of them thickened, invisible but suffocating. Then, suddenly, Nastasia rose, the soft rustle of her gown slicing through the silence. Let's not drown in this gloom, she declared, voice sharp and bright. Let's make this evening unforgettable. Her smile returned, cold and dazzling. She turned to Rogozin, eyes glittering with challenge. You say you would spend your fortune on me. Is that true? Rogozin straightened, lips curling. Every kopeck, then prove it. A gasp rippled through the room. Rogozin's hand moved to his coat, pulling free a bundle of crisp banknotes. Without hesitation, he tossed them into the fireplace. The flames crackled and devoured the money, casting a sickly glow over the room. Gasps turned to stunned silence. Nastasia laughed, but it rang hollow. How easy it is for you to burn what others would kill for. Her gaze slid to Mishkin, curious, almost mocking. And you, Prince? What would you burn for me? Mishkin's expression didn't change. He met her eyes calmly. Nothing, he said softly. Because love isn't proven with ashes. Her smile faltered. Rogozin's fist tightened for a moment. No one moved. Then, without warning, Nastasia strode toward Mishkin. You pity me, don't you? She whispered. I understand you, he replied. That truth struck her deeper than any insult. She laughed again, but it trembled. You are a fool, Prince. A dangerous fool. Turning on her heel, she addressed the room. Enough games. Let's end this night properly. Her hand swept across the table, sending glasses shattering to the floor. Let's see which of you is man. Enough to claim me. The guests recoiled, scandalized, but Rogozin stepped forward, his breath heavy. Come with me. The room seemed to hold its breath, yet Nastasia hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward Mishkin, and for the first time, she wavered outside. The wind howled against the walls, as if warning them of the storm yet to come. The air in the salon turned suffocating, thick with expectation. All eyes were on Nastasia Filipovna, caught between two men, one consumed by obsession, the other by compassion. Rogozin stood rigid, his face dark with fury and desperation. His outstretched hand trembled slightly, the firelight flickering in his cold eyes. Come with me, he repeated, his voice lower, more dangerous. But Nastasia did not move. Her gaze drifted to Prince Mishkin, who remained still, his expression soft and open. He made no demands, no promises. There was no force in him, only quiet understanding that unsettled her more than Rogozin's burning desire ever could. You, she whispered, eyes narrowing. You think you can save me? Mishkin shook his head slowly. No, but I would never harm you. The words settled heavily in the room. Rogozin's fists clenched. And what would you do, Prince? Offer her pity? That's all you have. Mishkin didn't answer. He simply looked at Nastasia with a quiet sadness that seemed to reach past the walls she had built. Nastasia laughed suddenly, sharp and brittle. Enough of this. She turned to Rogozin, her voice cold. You would buy me Parfyan, like property. And you, she said, turning to Mishkin, you would forgive me for sins I haven't even confessed. She stared at both of them, a wild glint in her eyes. Then let me decide. In a swift motion, she snatched the remaining stack of Rogozin's banknotes and flung them into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, devouring the paper greedily. Gasps echoed around the room. "Let it all burn," she cried, her voice rising above the crackling fire. "What is money, love, or forgiveness in this world? They are nothing." Her chest heaved, the fire reflecting wildly in her eyes. Then silence, and in that silence, Nastasia slowly turned back to Prince Mishkin. "Would you marry me, Prince?" The question struck the room like a thunderclap. Rogozin's face twisted in shock and rage, but Mishkin did not hesitate. His voice was steady, clear. Yes, the word fell into the silence like a stone. For the first time, Nastasia faltered. The room blurred around her, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. Was this a game to him? Or was it something real? "My God," she whispered, almost to herself. But then, her laughter returned shrill and frantic. "Fool," she shrieked. "Do you even know what you're saying? I'm no wife for a prince." She spun toward the door, her steps wild and uneven. "Come, Rogozin," she barked, her voice sharp as a blade. "Let's see how far you'll follow me into the dark." Without a backward glance, she disappeared into the cold night. Rogozin hesitated, torn between rage and triumph. His eyes flicked. To Mishkin, burning with hatred, "This isn't over," he hissed, and then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Mishkin stood alone, the flames crackling behind him. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of St. Petersburg, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the echoes of broken hearts. The storm had only just begun. The coldness of the night clung to the streets like a ghost. Mishkin stood in the salon, his gaze lost in the crackling fire, the echoes of Nastasia's frantic laughter still lingering in the air. He hadn't moved since she left, her absence filling the room with a suffocating silence. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, as if the city itself mourned. The shadows stretched long and dark, pulling at his heart in ways he didn't understand. Prince Mishkin was a man out of time, a soul untethered by the world around him. He had walked into this storm unwittingly, but now he was caught in its fury. In the distance, the sound of Rogozin's retreating footsteps echoed impatient. Driven like the beat of a drum that only grew louder, his thoughts drifted back to Nastasia, to the way she had looked at him. Her eyes had held so much fear, rage, vulnerability, and something else. A plea, a call for salvation, perhaps. But salvation came with a price, and he knew that now. The very thing he wished to offer her might cost him everything he had seen. The darkness in her, the pain buried deep beneath the surface. But he had also seen something else. A flicker of hope, a crack in the fortress she had built around herself. The prince could not abandon that light, no matter how fleeting it seemed. It was his nature to help, to love, to understand. But the cost of that love was something he had yet to grasp. The next day, the tension in the city was palpable. Word of the events in the salon had spread like wildfire, and soon the entire town seemed to be whispering about Prince Mishkin and his involvement with the enigmatic Nastasia Filipovna. Was he a fool? A savior? No one could say for sure. Mishkin found himself in the drawing room of the Yepinchins, where the laughter had once been carefree. Now, however, the air was thick with apprehension. General Yepinchin sat at the head of the room, his brows furrowed in concern, a prince without a kingdom. He muttered to himself, rubbing his chin. "Tell me, prince, what is it you seek here, among these people?" Mishkin looked at the general with soft eyes. "I seek nothing but to understand." The general snorted. Understanding. Here, in this city of fools? Mishkin did not answer. His gaze drifted over to Aglaya, the general's youngest daughter. She was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, her eyes piercing. "You don't believe in love, do you, Prince?" she asked, her voice light but sharp. Mishkin looked at her, surprised by the question. "I believe in love more than anything else," he said, his voice gentle. "But love is not something we can control. It is not something we can force." Aglaia raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "And Nastasia Philippovna, do you think she's capable of love?" Mishkin hesitated. "She is capable of many things. But love is not one of them, at least. Not the way most of us know it." Aglaia's expression softened. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You're different from most men," she said quietly. "You are. Unafraid to look at people for who they really are." Mishkin smiled faintly. "What is there to fear in understanding?" Aglaia's gaze flickered to the door, where her mother stood, watching them. "You'll find out," she murmured under her breath, more to herself than to the prince. Before Mishkin could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. The servant entered, holding a letter in her hand. "It's from Rogozin," she said, handing the letter to the prince. Mishkin took it, his fingers trembling slightly. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the handwriting. The letter was brief, but its contents were clear. "Meet me at the house on the outskirts of the city tonight." Without another word, Mishkin folded the letter and stood, his mind already racing. He had no idea what awaited him, but one thing was certain. The path he had chosen would not be an easy one. As he left the drawing room, the air outside seemed colder than ever. The wind whispered of danger, of a fate that was already sealed. The city of St. Petersburg stretched before him like an endless labyrinth, its cobblestone streets leading nowhere and everywhere all at once. Prince Mishkin walked alone through the biting cold, his thoughts consumed by the events of the past few days. Nastasia's words, Rogozin's obsession, and the quiet weight of the Yepinchin household, all of it tangled together, a web that seemed impossible to untangle. As he reached the outskirts of the city, the familiar sounds of bustling streets faded into the background, replaced by the eerie silence of the empty, snow-covered roads. The house Rogozin had summoned him to stood at the edge of a small, secluded square, its windows dark and foreboding. The wind howled through the branches of bare trees, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Mishkin stood before the door, hesitating for a moment. The sense of impending danger was thick in the air, but he knew he had to go inside. For Nastasia, for Rogozin, for whatever was waiting for him in that house. He knocked once, the sound hollow in the quiet night. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Rogozin stood in the threshold, his face shadowed, his eyes burning with an intensity that Mishkin had come to recognize all too well. "Come in," Rogozin said curtly, stepping aside to allow the prince to enter. The house was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The scent of burning wood filled the air, and Mishkin's gaze immediately sought out the figure sitting in the corner of the room. Nastasia Philippovna, her face pale and drawn, her eyes locked on the floor, as if avoiding the world around her. Rogozin closed the door behind them and moved to the table, his back to the prince. "She's here," he said, his voice low and strained. "But she's not the same. Not after last night. Not after what you did." Mishkin's heart tightened in his chest. He had done nothing but offer his hand, his heart. And yet, it seemed that his very presence had thrown them all into chaos. He turned to Nastasia, his voice soft and gentle. "Nastasia," he said, his tone tender, "I never meant to cause you pain." She raised her head slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since their encounter in the salon. There was a hardness in her gaze, a wariness, But there was also something else. A flicker of recognition, of something that could not be easily defined. "You came," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. "Why did you come?" Mishkin's chest tightened at the question. He wanted to tell her that he had come because he saw something in her, something worth saving. But the words seemed too small for the weight of the moment. "I came because I could not turn away," he said simply. "I came because I know what it is like to be lost. And I believe that you are not beyond help." Nastasia's lips parted, but no words came. Her hands trembled slightly, and she looked away from him, as if his gaze were too much to bear. Rogozin stepped forward, his voice filled with bitterness. "Help? Do you think she wants your help? Do you think she deserves it? She's a poison. Mishkin. A poison to everyone around her." Mishkin turned to Rogozin, his expression soft but firm. "She is not poison. She is hurt. She is lost. And she deserves kindness, not hatred." Rogozin's eyes flashed with fury, but he did not speak. He stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, breathing heavily. Nastasia rose from her chair slowly, her eyes fixed on Mishkin. "You really think you can save me, don't you?" she whispered, almost to herself. "You really think that your kindness can fix all the broken parts of me?" Mishkin didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to her, his gaze steady and compassionate. "No," he said softly, "I don't think I can fix you, but I believe that you are worth fighting for, that you can find peace if only you allow. Yourself too." Her eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned away, walking toward the window. She stood there, staring out at the dark, snowy street beyond, as if seeking something out there that might offer her the answers she couldn't find within. Rogozin's voice broke through the silence. "You are a fool, Prince." He spat, his tone venomous. "She will break you. She will tear you apart. And when she's done, there will be nothing left of you." Mishkin turned to face him, his eyes calm. "I already know that," he said quietly. "But I would rather be broken by the truth than live in the lie of denial." There was a long, tense silence. Then Rogozin turned and walked toward the door, his movements stiff with rage. "You'll see, Prince. You'll see that you can't save her. No one can." As he opened the door, he paused, looking back at Mishkin. "But perhaps you will be the one who pays the highest price." With that, he left, the door slamming shut behind him. Mishkin stood alone in the dimly lit room, his heart heavy with the weight of the choices before him. Nastasia was still at the window, her back turned to him, her silhouette bathed in the pale light from outside. The prince felt a surge of both hope and despair. He had come here with the belief that love could heal, that compassion could mend the broken parts of a soul. But now, he wondered if he had been wrong. Could love truly save someone so lost, so consumed by her own darkness? And yet, as he watched her, he could not bring himself to turn away, for there was one truth he could not deny, no matter the cost. He had chosen this path, and the storm that followed would change them all. The days blurred together as Mishkin remained in the cold, desolate house, watching Nastasia slowly unravel. Her beauty, once sharp and mesmerizing, now seemed hollow, drained of life. She would sit for hours, her gaze distant, her hands motionless in her lap. As if the weight of her own existence was too much to bear, Rogozin's absence only seemed to deepen the void between them, the house growing quieter with each passing hour. Mishkin had tried to offer comfort, but every word he spoke felt like an echo in a room with no walls. Nastasia would not meet his eyes for days, and when she did, it was with a look that made him question everything he believed about love, about salvation. Her silence was more suffocating than any argument. It was the silence of someone who had long since given up. One evening, as the snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in a blanket of white, Nastasia finally spoke. "You think you can change me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you can't." "No one can." Mishkin, who had been standing by the window, turned to face her. "I don't want to change you. I only want to help you find peace." "Peace?" She laughed, but the sound was hollow, like a door creaking on its hinges. "What peace is there for someone like me? I've destroyed everything I've touched. There's no redemption. Only ruin." Her words stung like a slap. Mishkin felt a deep ache in his chest as he looked at her, the woman who had captivated his every thought, every emotion. She was broken, and there was no easy fix. He knew that now, but even in the depths of her despair, there was a part of him that refused to give up on her. "Peace isn't something that comes easily," he said softly, "but it's there waiting. We just have to be willing to reach for it." Nastasia didn't respond. She simply turned away, looking out the window once more, her expression unreadable. Mishkin moved closer, sitting down beside her. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The crackling fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room. Then, without warning, Nastasia turned to him, her face twisted with anguish. "Do you know what it's like, Prince? To feel as though the world is collapsing around you, to know that you're the one who built the destruction." Mishkin didn't answer. He simply looked at her, trying to convey through his gaze that he understood that he saw her pain. "I am not a saint," Nastasia continued, her voice rising in a desperate crescendo. "I have done terrible things, and I can't escape them. No matter how hard I try." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. Mishkin reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers, a gesture of comfort that she did not resist. "I don't believe you are beyond saving," he whispered. "You are more than your past. You are more than the mistakes you've made." Nastasia's eyes flickered with something resentment, perhaps, or a fleeting hope. She pulled her hand away. Standing abruptly, "Why do you insist on this?" she asked, her voice sharp with pain. "Why do you want to save me? What have I ever done to deserve your pity?" Mishkin stood as well, his heart racing in his chest. "It's not pity," he said, his voice steady but filled with an earnestness that surprised even him. "It's love. It's understanding. It's a choice." Her face hardened, and she took a step back. "Love? Do you think love can save anyone? Love is a lie, Prince. It's an illusion. It doesn't heal the broken pieces. It just buries them deeper." The words cut through him, but he refused to let them break him. "I don't believe that," he said quietly. "I believe love is the only thing that can heal the broken pieces. And I believe you are worthy of that love." Nastasia's eyes welled with tears, and she turned away again, her shoulders shaking. Mishkin stepped forward, his heart aching for her. But before he could reach her, the door burst open, and Rogozin stormed into the room, his face pale and wild. "Enough," he shouted, his voice raw with fury. "Enough of this nonsense, Prince. She doesn't want your pity. She doesn't need your salvation." Rogozin's eyes were crazed, his fists clenched at his sides. "I won't let you take her from me. I won't let you destroy her any more than she already has been." Mishkin stepped back, his heart sinking. He had known this moment was coming, but it still felt like a blow to the chest. Nastasia, who had been standing motionless by the window, suddenly collapsed to her knees, her sobs racking her body. "No, Parfyan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want this anymore. I don't want this pain. I don't want to hurt you both. Rogozin's expression softened for a brief moment, but then it hardened again, his gaze turning dark. With obsession, you don't get to choose. Nastasia, he spat, his voice full of venom. You belong to me. You always have. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Nastasia looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The tension in the room was unbearable. Mishkin stood between them, a fragile barrier in a storm of rage and anguish. You don't own her, Rogozin, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Nastasia is not a possession. She is a person with her own choices, her own life, Rogozin sneered, his gaze filled with hatred. And what are you, Prince? Her knight in shining armor? You think you can save her? You think you can fix her? She's already broken beyond repair. Mishkin met his eyes, unflinching. Maybe, he said quietly, but I will never stop trying. Rogozin took a step forward, his hand reaching into his coat. Mishkin tensed, sensing the danger that loomed. Nastasia gasped. No, don't, but before she could say another word, Rogozin pulled out a small, gleaming knife. Mishkin's heart stopped as the cold steel caught the light of the fire. You want to save her? Rogozin spat, his voice low and menacing. Then you'll have to fight for her. The room seemed to hold its breath as Rogozin stood there, the knife gleaming in his hand like a dark promise. Mishkin's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to understand what was happening, what had already happened. Nastasia's gasp echoed in the silence, and she shrank back, her hand instinctively reaching out for Mishkin, as though he could protect her from the fury that Rogozin now embodied. Put it down, Rogozin, Mishkin said quietly, his voice trembling but firm, eyes locked on the knife. This isn't the way. Rogozin's eyes were wild, unseeing, his chest heaving with every labored breath. You think I'll just let you take her from me? He snarled. You think I'll just stand by and watch you destroy everything I've built? You think your soft words and your pity will save her? No, no one can save her, least of all you. The knife seemed to glow under the firelight as it wavered in Rogozin's hand. His expression was almost unrecognizable, twisted with grief, rage, and something far more dangerous. His body trembled with emotion, his every movement sharp and jerky, as if he were caught between some primal urge and a breaking point that had been long in the making. Mishkin stood still, his hands by his sides, watching Rogozin's every move with intense focus. His heart raced, but his face remained calm, unyielding. He couldn't show fear. Not now. I'm not trying to take her from you, Mishkin said, his voice low, soothing. I don't want to fight you, Parfyan. I don't want to destroy anything. But this isn't love, this is destruction. Rogozin's eyes flickered, the anger in them still burning hot, but something else lingered there too. Doubt, confusion, a hint of uncertainty, masked by his rage. You think she deserves better than this? Rogozin spat, his voice cracking. You think she deserves peace? How? How can you give her something she doesn't want? She's nothing but a ruined woman, a curse, a burden. Nastasia, who had been frozen, her back pressed against the wall, now broke into a choked sob. I don't want this anymore, Parfyan, she whispered through the tears. I don't want to be this. I don't want to hurt you both. Mishkin's eyes softened, a pang of sympathy striking deep within him. He understood. She was lost, broken, in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend, but still she was there. She was still alive, still fighting against the forces of darkness within her. Mishkin's right, Nastasia continued, her voice cracking with vulnerability. I don't want to hurt you, Rogozin. I never did. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep running from the things I've done, from what I am. The room fell into a haunting silence. Rogozin's hand shook, the knife trembling in his grasp as his gaze fell to the floor. He seemed to lose his will to fight, his chest heaving with the weight of his own emotions, his body collapsing inward as though the fury had been drained from him all at once. I don't know what to do anymore, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mishkin took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Rogozin, his hand held out in a gesture of peace, of understanding. You don't have to do anything, Parfyan. You don't have to fight. For a moment, everything seemed suspended, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The snow outside fell in thick. Silent sheets, the storm that raged within the house echoing the turmoil in their hearts. Rogozin's grip on the knife loosened. Slowly, he dropped it onto the floor with a sharp clatter, the sound loud in the stillness. He sank to his knees, his face buried in his hands as he sobbed, his body racked with uncontrollable grief. I love her, he whispered. I love her, but I don't know how to love her. Mishkin knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Love isn't about control, Parfyan. It's about letting go. It's about giving someone the space to heal, to choose. You can't force love, no matter how hard you try. Nastasia, still standing by the window, turned to them, her face streaked with tears. She looked at the two men, Rogozin, the man who had once claimed her heart in a wild, obsessive frenzy, and Mishkin, the prince who had offered her understanding and compassion. Both of them were broken in their own ways, and yet both of them cared for her. Both of them saw her in the light of their own understanding, but in that moment, it became clear to Mishkin that his love, though pure, was not enough. It wasn't enough to undo the years of pain Nastasia had endured. It wasn't enough to heal the scars that both she and Rogozin bore. Love, he realized, could never be the magic cure all he had hoped for. Nastasia walked slowly toward the door, her footsteps silent in the cold room. She paused, looking back over her shoulder at the two men who had claimed pieces of her heart. I don't know what to do with all of this, she whispered, and in the space between them, silence fell. The room was suffocating with tension, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Mishkin watched Nastasia as she stood by the door, her back to him, her hands gripping the cold iron handle. His heart ached for her, aching with the knowledge that whatever decision she made, there would be no simple answers. The world had conspired to bring them all to this breaking point, and now, in this dim-lit room, they stood on the edge of fate. Nastasia took a breath, steadying herself, as though bracing for something inevitable. Her hands trembled, but she did not turn to face either of them. Maybe it's better this way, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Maybe it's better if I leave. Mishkin's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to stop her. He wanted to tell her that there was still hope, still a chance for them, all to find some peace. But the words stuck in his throat. He knew that she had already made up her mind. He knew that sometimes the only way to survive the weight of one's own demons was to escape, to run far away and hope that somewhere, out there would be a way to start over. You can't run forever, Nastasia, Mishkin said softly, his voice filled with sadness. You'll always carry the past with you, no matter where you go. But that doesn't mean you can't try to heal. She shook her head, her long, dark hair falling over her shoulders. I've tried, she whispered. I've tried so hard to fix myself, but it's never enough. I'll always be broken, and I'm tired of dragging everyone down with me. Rogozin, who had been silent for so long, stood up from his place on the floor, his expression raw and empty. "Nastasia," he said hoarsely, his voice cracking with the weight of his own grief. "Don't leave. Please. I love you." Her shoulders trembled at the words, but she didn't turn around. She only stared at the door, her eyes unfocused, as though lost in some private world of pain and confusion. "You love me?" Nastasia asked, her voice bitter, as though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "You love me, and yet you're the one who caused all this madness. You're the one who trapped me in a cage of your own making. What kind of love is that?" Rogozin flinched as if struck. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he pleaded. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never did. But I can't. I can't live without you." Nastasia turned her head slightly, just enough for Mishkin to see the torment in her eyes. "But you never really saw me, did you?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You only saw the woman you wanted me to be. And now all of this destruction, is because neither of you ever saw who I truly was." The words were like a knife to Mishkin's heart, but he said nothing. He didn't know how to respond to her pain. He didn't know how to fix the brokenness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. No matter how far she ran, there was a long, painful silence. Finally, Nastasia opened the door and stepped outside, her figure disappearing into the swirling snowstorm. Mishkin didn't move to stop her. He couldn't. In that moment, he realized that no matter how much he wished to save her, it was not within his power to do so. Some battles, some scars could not be healed by love alone. Rogozin stumbled forward, his face twisted in anguish. "Nastasia," he called, but his voice was lost in the wind, swallowed by the snow that had begun to fall heavier outside. Mishkin stood still, watching the snowflakes swirl in the darkness. The world outside felt as cold and empty as the house behind him. He had tried. They had all tried. But sometimes the weight of the past was too much for any of them to bear, and Nastasia, for all her beauty, her pain, and her sorrow, had made her choice. She had walked away from them both, as she had done so many times before in her life. But this time, there would be no return. Mishkin could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He understood, in that quiet, desolate moment, that he had come to terms with the fact that love, no matter how pure, could not heal all wounds. And sometimes the best one could do was let go and allow the other person the space to walk their own path. As the door closed softly behind him, Mishkin turned and walked back into the room, the fire still flickering in the hearth. Rogozin had collapsed onto the floor, his head buried in his hands as he wept in despair. Mishkin knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, offering what comfort he could. But there was little to offer now. The storm had passed, and the silence that followed was louder than any words could be. The three of them broken, lost, and uncertain were left with nothing but their own pain, their own choices, and the lingering hope that perhaps in the distant future they might find peace. But that was not today. Not today. The story, like their lives, was unfinished, and with that, the final chapter of their journey ends.